When you install xStream on your system with Lightwave already installed, the plugin will automatically be loaded into Lightwave, but you will have to manually add it to your interface in order to access all of the features. So the first thing we're going to do is go to Edit and then Menu Layout. And I'm also using the Studio Production style, which is the way I have everything set up right now. I think it's a little bit of a better way to work within Lightwave, especially in the newer versions. On the left we can see all of our commands, and I'm going to expand plugins. And if we move all the way down, we'll be able to see that we have View xStream. And what I like to do is just move this above our scene editor, and that way it's going to stay on the top of all of our windows, no matter which tab we're in. So I can click Done. And now when I move to Animate, Setup, Dynamics, any of the other ones, we can still see that we have the View xStream plugin on the top of all of that. So let's go ahead and click on this button now. We're going to see this is going to open our xStream window, which is going to give us a couple of different buttons. We have the new scene option. And the new scene option is for when you want to create an entirely custom new scene. The load scene option will allow us to load in scenes we've already created from View xStream standalone or even View Infinite. We also have allows us to immediately access the atmosphere editor within View without having to switch back and forth between the applications, and it can be a lot quicker sometimes. And we'll take a look at all of these once we actually start working on a scene, because right now some of these options aren't really going to show up. If we go to the Options panel and open that, we see it's first going to start up xStream because it was currently not loaded, and until you load in a scene or create a new one, you won't see that. And under Options we can see a lot of different settings, but of course right now we really can't see anything because we don't have anything loaded. So let's go ahead and go to New Scene. And now if I hadn't clicked on Options before, we would now see the View splash screen show up, loading. And I'm just going to go to our Spectral Sunshine and select our default. And all of these options and skies are going to be the ones that are available within xStream standalone, so all the ones you load in normally, and it's all coming from the same content folder from your standard View scenes. So I'm just going to go with our default sky and click OK. And now it's going to ask us if we'd like to keep our Lightwave default light and camera. And the reason for this is that once we have View completely loaded, we're going to have a new light and a new camera. And what that's going to be is the View camera and the View light. And you can use both of them within your scene. You can use the Lightwave light, but that's going to interfere with the View light. And really it's going to end up being about the same thing, so you technically don't need to keep the Lightwave default light and camera, because you can always add new cameras later. And for the lighting, you usually want to set that up within View. So I'm going to select No, and now we can see the ground plane that we typically have within a View scene. And if we want to switch over to View now, let's go up to our plugin panel that's open. We're going to select View Interface, and that's going to switch us over. And I just want to double click on our side view, and that way we can pull up the 4 viewports that we have. And now we can see in our main camera view. And let's take a look at some of the synchronization that there is between our different cameras in the two programs. And the easiest way to really see this is if I load in an object. So first I'm going to add in a tree, and I'll just load in our rural maple tree. And we're just going to position ourselves within View. And now if we switch over to Lightwave, which we can do by going up to File and Hide View Interface, or we can use Alt-Tab on the keyboard if you're working in Windows, and that will switch you between the different programs. So you can see that right now I've got Lightwave open, but the view interface is no longer open, so I can switch back to the view interface. That'll open up, and now if I go back to Alt-Tab, we can see that view along with Lightwave, and we can swap back and forth between those two different programs. So that's sometimes the easiest way to do it, is just to go back and forth. But if we take a look now within Lightwave, we can see that tree showing up, and also that we have that selected within view. So if we go back to view and deselect, and then we can see it's still showing up as pretty much selected. But that's okay. We're going to focus mainly on the cameras. And once we start loading in other objects, that'll overall view will change. We can go back. And now we can see once we immediately switch over to view, the camera hasn't really updated. Once we sort of reset the OpenGL, it will, because the camera has moved. It's just that our OpenGL viewports really aren't showing it. If I expand the camera view in full, now we can see that little bit of rotation that I've added, and now they're matched up. So let's go ahead and move the camera once again in Lightwave. We can kind of move it back this time, switch over, and once again you can see that that OpenGL hasn't updated. And one way we could easily fix this is just to click on the zoom, or actually the move function of the camera within our controls. And if you just do a quick click on that, it won't move the camera, but it will refresh the OpenGL. So sometimes you do have to sort of click on that. Another way is just to select an object usually. So if we move our camera once again to show that movement, go into view, and now select our maple tree, we're going to see everything update. So it's really just refreshing that OpenGL that you have to worry about as far as seeing the synchronization between the two programs, because it doesn't always just refresh that GL, and you can usually just select an object in order to take care of that. So that is our camera synchronization, at least to the base movement of it. What I want to do is go over to view and just create a little bit of an animation, and that way we can see how that all syncs up as well, and also our camera options. So I'm going to delete our maple tree, and I can see once we selected it, it refreshed our view. I'm going to go up into the camera options within xStream, and I'm just going to set a couple of different quality settings. Right now, mainly these settings aren't going to affect our scene too much, not at this point. I'm going to set a few things in case we want to do some renders within view. But we do want to focus on our resolution. Right now we're working in 4:3 aspect ratio. Well, I'm going to change this to 16:9, and then also we can increase the overall resolution. So let's go to Other and change the height value to 720. And that's going to give us a 720p HD resolution. And we can see that update within view. And now if we switch over to Lightwave, we'll see the OpenGL refresh, and now we have that full viewport where if we go to our camera properties, we'll be able to see that resolution has transferred over. So that's a really nice thing that's available, is that our resolutions will stay completely synced. Go ahead and close that out right now, and go back into view, and I'm going to load in a procedural terrain and zoom out. We're going to go to our scale option and just our scale gizmo, and we can move that procedural terrain and size it up. And I want to create a little bit of a valley to sort of fly through, so I can right mouse click on our terrain and go to edit object, or double click on it. And now within the terrain editor, I'm going to turn off zero edges so that we lose that mountainous look. And if I just scale down our function, because we're just going to work with this default function right now, which should be fine. And we'll bring that scale down to 0.4, making sure we're in the procedural tab. We can click OK, and that's going to refresh our terrain. And now let's switch over to Lightwave, and we can see Because this is a procedural terrain, and within View that is a geometry that is constantly updating itself, because it's basically an infinite amount of detail depending on how close we get to it. Well, once we see that terrain within Lightwave, it's going to be very reduced as far as its quality and the overall detail that we see. With the standard terrain, that's not going to happen, but with procedural terrains, we will definitely not see as much. We're going to go back into xStream, and first I want to create an animation for our camera within View. So we're going to select our main camera, and I also want to pull up our animation timeline, so I can hit F11 on the keyboard to bring that up. And I'm going to create a 5-second animation, so we can just drag our slider to 5 seconds, and now we can move our camera into our terrain, add a little bit of rotation, maybe looking up a little bit towards the sky, maybe move it down. And because I have keyframing on, which is the auto keyframing, it created that key for me, so I don't need to manually add it. And now we can scrub through that animation within View. Now I can also go ahead and play that, just flying through our terrain. And now if we switch over to Lightwave, we're going to see that our frame amount has now updated to 150 frames. And if I click play, we'll be able to watch the animation directly within Lightwave, and we can tell that our camera is now completely synced up to that. So if we switch to our perspective view, we'll just zoom out, and I'm going to change our grid size so we can see that a little bit better. And currently right now, that's not working for me. And there might be something selected that's restricting that, but it shouldn't be a problem. So we're going to select our camera, and we can see that in our scene right there. And now as we scrub through the animation, we can see our camera showing up. And all that motion is completely there. Oh, and the reason why I wasn't able to change the grid size, if we go down to the lower right, I was selected where our keyframe max amount is, so I'll change that to 150, and now I can change our grid size so that we can view the scene a little bit easier. And we can just see that amount of motion that we're able to create just changing by the amount of grid size that we have. So if we bring that down, we can have a lot more motion in between our objects and view things a little bit easier. And scrub through. And now what I want to do is remove this animation. So we're going to go into View, select our main camera, go up to Animation, and then we can destroy Object Animation. And now the animation is completely gone. If you go into our camera view, scrub through, we're not going to see anything. So let's go back to 150 frame. So the last frame that we have in our animation, I can select our camera. We're going to move it. Let's create a little bit of a different animation this time. And now we can move our camera through the scene. And if we switch over to View, we're going to see that our animation between our camera is now directly showing up within View. But keep in mind, we're not seeing the keyframes, because the keyframes are not being carried over. They're going to be specific to the one program that we're working with. So usually what you want to do is create your keyframes pretty much in one main program and stick with that program. So you either create them entirely within Lightwave and kind of stay within Lightwave, or create them within View and kind of stay within that. If we move our animation to about halfway, we'll go around 2.5. So let's just do frame 215. and I'm going to move our camera, we're going to see that we run into some problems. And that's because we've just created a keyframe, and we had a little bit of an OpenGL refresh that needed to be done. If we go to our top view and just kind of zoom out and select our main camera, we can see that's not really in the correct place, and nothing's really matched up because I changed that keyframe within view. It could also be part of the overall scale ratio. Let's take a look at that. Within our plugin, we want to go to our options panel, and we can see there is a global scale option on the bottom. Now right now, because of my interface background, it's a little hard to see the G in global scale, but it is there, and also the S and C in scale, but I can change our scale ratio up to 10, which is usually going to give us an exact change between meters and whatever we have available. So what I want to do is just destroy this object animation for our camera now, because we kind of messed it up. And currently, right now, I technically do not see the camera. We're going to go to our movement options and change our position back to 0 for everything, and just sort of reset that so we can see it once again, because it really threw off exactly where our camera was located. So now we can take our main camera, move this into position, and now that we have that scale ratio changed, let's try that again and see if it syncs up. So we'll go to frame 150, and I'm going to delete that key that we currently have, and we can create a new one. And now you can also see that little bit of a change that we had, and now our camera is kind of thrown off again. So we need to go to our main camera and destroy the object animation. And what I want to do is go back to frame 0 and reset the position. So you can see it can be very touchy depending on what certain settings are changed and in which program. But normally it's not a huge deal if you're just directly creating keyframes within one program. We'll go ahead and change our position, go back into Lightwave, and now let's create that new keyframe at 150, select our camera, and now you can see we're having some huge issues, and all really because we created that keyframe in different programs. So what I need to do is clear out our scene, and we're going to create a new one to sort of fix that issue. So it's very important that most of the time you're really kind of working in one major program for your camera keyframes. So we'll go to File, and we're going to clear this scene. And now you're going to see that view is no longer open. We can go to New Scene, select our default. I'm not going to keep our Lightwave camera or light. And if we go into our view interface, we're just going to set that up once again. So we can change that to final, render to screen, 16:9, and for the other, change that to 720, so we're working with 720p HD resolution. Go into the terrain editor once we create our procedural terrain. We're just going to size that up first. And I'm going to move this a little bit higher. And we'll turn off zero edges. Change our scale down to about 0.4. Click OK. Reposition our camera within the scene. And we'll just look for a good spot to kind of get the camera in there. Okay, and we can go back into Lightwave, see that refresh. And now we're going to go to our options and make sure that scale ratio is still set to 10. Another thing to keep in mind is you usually want to use the slider to change that scale ratio, because sometimes when you enter the numeric value in manually, it will not stay. So it's good to use the slider for that. But let's try that once again. We're going to go create 150 total frames, move our slider all the way to frame 150, select our camera, and give it a little bit of motion. We'll just move over our terrain, kind of look down, and now we can see that motion showing up. And go back into View, hit F11, and now you can actually see that the keyframes are showing up this time. So you can see that sometimes we will be able to see the keyframes, but in some instances they do not show up. And whether or not it was the scale ratio, I'm not quite sure. But we can see it's still showing up in both programs, so now we have keyframes in both programs. And now, because we created these within Lightwave, let's just try and create a keyframe within View. We'll go ahead and rotate our camera. A little bit of movement. Go back into Lightwave, and now we can see once again that has thrown off our scene. So definitely for sure you want to be creating your keyframes in one program only. But you will see them sync up between each other. And typically I would recommend using Lightwave for that. We'll go ahead and clear out our scene. Just because Lightwave can be a little bit easier to move around in. But of course, if you really have a very detailed view scene, you'd want to be able to especially tell exactly where certain parts of your procedural terrains are. But you know, that always matters and depends on what exactly you're working on and whether or not you created the scene within View first or you created it within Lightwave first. And I do want to go back into that options panel and we can take a look at some of those different settings, mainly that global scale. So what we want to do is create a new scene, and I'm not going to keep the default camera. And what I want to show you now is really the effects of that global scale. And the best way to see that is if we have an object loaded in into Lightwave. So I just want to load in a quick sphere. And we'll just go ahead and load that in. And now we can see the sphere in the scene. And another thing to keep in mind is more than likely the reason why we were seeing that red outline before was because I have the camera view set to wireframe. So even though the rest of the scene was still kind of showing up with a flat shaded look, it still kind of had that bit of a wireframe showing through, and that can happen because the way we would change our views, which we'll take a look at later, is pretty much done within the scene editor. But now we have a Lightwave object within our scene, and now we need to add pretty much something for comparison. So we're going to go over to our view interface, which I haven't opened yet. So select view interface, and I'm going to add in a sphere within view and move that off to the side. And now if we take a look at the scales between these two different objects, and more specifically the actual sizes of the objects. So if we go back to view and we see that our sphere scale is about 6 meters all the way across. And if we take a look right now, that's pretty much matching up. Because if we go to our options, we can see the scale ratio is set to 10, which is the correct way. By default, it's at 1. If I click OK, we can really see that major change where we have the Lightwave object is now huge, and this 6 meter object is really only showing up what it looks about 1 to 2 meters by looking at the grid size. And actually it appears to be less than a meter. So that global scale ratio can be really important for sizing everything correctly. If we change the scale ratio to 50 and click OK, go back to our camera view, now we can see the view object is enormous compared to our Lightwave object. But to get the meters to correctly match up, we have to set it to a scale ratio of 10. And now we can see the 6 meters. If I switch over to our perspective view, And our grid size is currently set to 1 meter. And if we take a look, we can see that the width of this object, and of course the height as well, is going to be 6 of our grid blocks. And that way, we know that it's matching up correctly. If we go back into the options panel, we can take a look at some of the other settings that we have. Under our first option, we can see that we have Incorporate View Scene into Lightwave File. Now it's really important that you pay attention to whether or not you have this on or off, because if we were to create a scene within Lightwave, and of course have a view scene xStream worked into that, and then we saved our Lightwave scene, we would also need to save our view scene as a separate file. Now this can be helpful because that way you can go into View separately while not working in Lightwave and sort of use the standalone version and work on a scene. But if you want to just be able to save it all at once, you can incorporate the view scene into the Lightwave file. So when you save your Lightwave scene, we'll automatically save the view scene embedded within the Lightwave file, and there won't be anything separate. So sometimes it's a good idea to have those separate files if you want to be working on them separately. But typically, if you're going to be working on a scene that is part of Lightwave, you can just open up the plugin interface and then sort of work in between them anyway. So really either way is a good method. If we take a look at the OpenGL preview, we have a Hide Infinite Plane from Preview. If I click OK, after turning that off, we can see that the infinite plane from View, although it is still in our scene, is currently not showing up within our preview. So we can easily turn that on or off. The next option is Assign View Active Camera to the LW viewport. And this pretty much is going to make sure that if we're working mainly with our view camera, even though we have other Lightwave cameras, we'll be able to definitely see that camera through the camera view while working with that. If we have multiple cameras that are both from Lightwave and the main view camera, sometimes you can run into problems where you won't be able to access that view directly if that is not turned on. Our next option is Detailed Preview. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. And right now we're really seeing any changes because our scene is extremely simple. So let's go ahead and change that. I'm just going to remove that Lightwave object and then go back into xStream and remove that sphere that we have in there. And let's just paint in a little bit of a ecosystem. So we're going to go to our top view. We can also see the old OpenGL showing up, but once we click on the view, it will refresh itself. Open up the ecosystem painter. We're going to add in a plant. I'll just select that maple tree once again. We're going to go to our brush and just kind of paint a few of these in there, sort of randomly. Go back into Lightwave, and now we can see those showing up. If we go to our options, turn on Detailed Preview, once again, we're not going to see a huge difference. And that really depends on our terrains and other options like that, because right now we have instances that are showing up, and really the quality of these instances doesn't get any more or less than this because they are in that billboard form where it's just a couple of image planes making up the preview of the object. So let's go back, and we're going to create a terrain behind that. And we're going to use a standard terrain this time where we can actually see the full quality a little bit better. Switch to our main camera view. I'm going to size that up and just move that behind those plants we had in there. And I also want to increase the resolution of our terrain, so I'm going to click a couple of times on the ×2 to bring us up to 1024 by 1024. And right now our preview isn't very high. If we go to our options, we can see that the instant draw is not turned up all the way. I'm going to go ahead and turn that up, and same thing with our plants as well. If you're working with a little bit of a slower video card, you may not want to turn these all the way up to the highest settings. And right now, with the standard terrain, basically going to look the same. That instant draw will really change the way procedural terrains look, but not so much with standard terrain. So we'll go back into Lightwave now, go to our options, turn off detailed preview, and click OK. And we're still not seeing too much of a change on these direct objects. So we're going to go back into our view interface and create a procedural terrain this time. And we can really see that updating with a much higher resolution. Scale that up, switch back into Lightwave, and now we can see the preview. Not the highest of quality because of the differences between the polygon qualities and just the way the overall interface views that. Let's go to Options, turn on Detailed Preview, click OK. Switch back between our programs, and once again that's kind of going to stay about the same. So we'll go back, and now let's take a look at a tree object. And we want to move that into position, and we can see the changes between those wireframe modes now too. Another reason I'm kind of adding a lot of different objects to here is because we are going to be taking a look at those preview settings. So now we can see we have a full resolution tree. We're going to go back into Lightwave, change this to texture shaded solid, and we can still see that that is selected within our Lightwave interface. So that little bit of an outline right now is kind of showing up as an error. I'm going to turn off detailed preview. We're not really seeing a huge amount of change, so we'll just go ahead and turn that back on. Overall, there doesn't really seem to be any major change between that, at least with this simple of a scene. But let's take a look at some of the other ways we can view this object, and the way that view is actually within our Lightwave scene, because of the way it's rendering within here. It's kind of important to know. First of all, if we take a look at our object, and we're going to just select objects so we can view all of them in the scene right now, and all we have is our view scene. And this is showing up as one entire object, which we can actually try to manipulate, but will not do us any good. So we'll change those position values back to 0, even though it really doesn't matter because of the way that is synced up to each other. But the way that this is actually loaded into our scene, we're going to need to open up the volumetric panel, which you can do by holding down Control and F6, and that will pull up our volumetrics, unless you have this set to a different way or a different keyboard shortcut. But we can take a look and see that xStream is loaded in as a volumetric. If we go to edit this, it will say that it has no interface, and that's because its interface is all actually view itself within the view interface, and the fact that the volumetric is even in there here is just to pretty much show how it's in the scene. And of course Lightwave always takes its volumetrics and puts it in this area. We can also determine our volumetric anti-aliasing this way as well, whether or not we want to have it turned on or off. And we'll take a look at that a little bit later, because it really can determine our render times and how we deal with all of those different settings between the two programs. But right now, if we take a look and switch our camera view to some of the different settings, overall we're not really seeing a major change. Let's go to our perspective view and modify some of these options. Bounding box, vertices, wireframe, and pretty much all of that is going to show up exactly the same. Of course it will change if I have it selected or not. And we can see the color showing up from our terrains when that is selected. But when I deselect, it'll sometimes go away. So it can be a little weird depending. If I select it now, the color will disappear. If I deselect it, the color will come back. It really depends on what you have selected. But overall, it's basically giving us a very accurate representation. If we go into our scene editor now, we're going to take a look at actually changing the view without using our viewport methods, because that's really what we're going to have to do in order to change this to wireframe and some of the other settings. So we take a look under where the eye is, and now we can change these to all the different modes. If we go to hidden, our scene will disappear completely. Bounding box, right now in this state, we're just going to see huge bounding boxes for our different terrains, and the trees that are instances are showing up. If we kind of move that out of the way so you can see it, the trees, since they're instances, they're not really objects in full, at least the way they're displayed. We're not seeing any bounding boxes around them. If we go to the view interface, I'm going to take this full-size tree in full resolution, and I want to move this out of the way of that terrain so we'd be able to see the effect of that. And now that full resolution tree is showing up as a bounding box. So let's change this to vertices, and now we're seeing basically a wireframe view because of the way the point system is kind of set up differently. We kind of zoom in a little to our tree. Within the perspective view, we're seeing basically a wireframe view with a nice color wireframe. Change this to our camera view, and we're going to end up seeing the exact same thing. So let's change that view scene to wireframe now, and I'm going to change this to our perspective view, and now we can tell that it's exactly the same look. So vertices and wireframe are going to look exactly the same just because of the way that those points really can't be separated from a view scene, because those objects are not built individually the way that objects within Lightwave are, where we create it sort of point by point and we can select those, but in View there's no point editing capabilities, so we don't see those points available. If we go to the front face wireframe, now we can see something a little bit different, and how this is varying between our procedural terrain, our standard terrain, and then of course our object. And I'll go ahead and close out this window so we can see that a little bit better. We can see our tree is really showing the front face wireframe, and all of our objects really will, but our terrains are still sort of showing up as an overall wireframe, although they are a little bit darker. Go back to our scene editor, change this to shaded solid, and now we can see a really nice look overall for our terrain, and our tree looks really good, and we don't have that wireframe look around our tree anymore where it was that highlighted red color, and overall it looks a really good preview. Go back into that scene editor, and now we can change this to texture shaded solid, which is also going to look about the same. And what I also want to do is just load on a material to that terrain and kind of show you the options for that. And we'll just go into our landscapes, and I'll load in rocks and plants, just to change the darkness of that. If we go back into Lightwave, now we can see that is showing up a lot darker, and it is correctly colored. And if we go to our procedural terrain, in this case what I want to do is load in a mapped picture, so we can edit the function, load in one of the bitmaps that just comes with View. We'll do the tile, put that on there, and now in our OpenGL interface we're currently not seeing that showing up. A little bit whiter now though, and if we switch over to Lightwave we can see that updating the overall color and how we're viewing the scene. Change our grid size a little, we can zoom in, we can go back into our scene editor, We can also see that we have texture shaded solid wireframe. And in that case, we're seeing our object once again, the tree, showing up as more of a red, and we're really seeing that overall wireframe look. I'm going to change that back to texture shaded solid, which is the one I like to work with the most because it gives us a really good view of what the scene is going to look like and a much better OpenGL render. Now let's also take a look at the display of this ecosystem, because typically if we go into view and we take a look at our painted eco, I'm going to open up our ecosystem painter, go to our display options. Now what we can do is turn on smooth shaded mode, and that's going to convert all of these instances to full quality trees, and we can just turn that off now and close out that panel. And we'll switch over to Lightwave, and we're going to see that all of those objects are going to show up as bounding boxes because it's a lot of geometry, and technically Lightwave can't handle as much geometry as View can handle. So we do see those bounding boxes, and also keep in mind, I was going to switch back. I'm going to stay here really quick. We're going to go to our display options, and we can see that the bounding box threshold is set extremely high. So keep in mind that is not part of it. It is just the fact that those instances are going to show up in full quality in View, but not necessarily within Lightwave. And right now my system is being a little bit unresponsive just because of the fact that I'm recording the screen, although normally there's a lot better feedback with those different instances. So we'll go to our ecosystem painter, and we just want to make sure we turn that off now. We'll go to billboard, back to our default, and also with full quality near camera we're going to see the same sort of an effect, and I'm just going to turn this up to where we can start to see those objects if this refreshes correctly. And doesn't look like it's going to, and that's mainly just because I'm recording the screen, and that does take a bit of the video card to use. So we'll turn that off. But basically, with the full quality near camera, we would normally see much better detailed trees towards the front, but those will show up as bounding boxes within Lightwave's main interface. And we're going to go back into the options, and we can see we can have some more settings. And under render we have our quality of the render, the view part of the scene's render, so basically our volumetric quality of this plugin. We have the ability to match the ambient light settings back and forth between the programs. If we open up our light panel, which we'd have to do closing this out, go to our light properties. Right now our ambient intensity, and these settings are all based off the overall lighting of that view light. We can also see the color and the intensity based on that scene as well. And if we go through, we can see it's a normal light, just like any other. Kind of zoom out, and it's basically just showing up as a distant light. And we'll take a look at more of our lighting options in the next section, just because there's a lot of different things we can do with the lights between the two programs. But let's go back into our options. We can also see whether or not and apply View's post-processing filters to the view cameras, which is a really nice option to have. We turn that on or off. And then we can also disconnect view lights and disconnect view cameras from our scene. So it's a really neat thing we can do. Because if we wanted to, we could just have a Lightwave camera, so then we could disconnect our view camera, or use a Lightwave light, disconnect the view light, and set which one we really want to use. Another cool thing we have is the multipass option is all available directly within the xStream options. So we can set whether or not we'd like to use the G buffer, and then we can render all of the different options for Z depth, materials, normals, and of course all of these multipass buffers that we have for just some really detailed scenes. Great for compositing if you're going to be going beyond the base render that we have within Lightwave. But that's basically it for our options, and then we're going to take a look at the way the lights work.